I've talked about this concept before, and I wanted to hit this pretty hard because this applies to whether you're hunting public or private land. Now, in private land, you can improve the situation. You can improve your hunt. You can improve the depth of cover that you have on private land. Public land, you need to look for it. But it's the same concepts. It's still just as critical, just as important. And I want to talk about how to find the best deer hunting cover, how to create the best deer hunting cover, and how you can ultimately turn 400 acres into 40 acres. And that's a bad thing. I want to see you turn 40 acres into 400 acres. That's a really good thing. There's a huge difference between the two, and even results in maximizing the value of the land and the investment you have into it, because there's a lot of wasted acres out here, and we're going to talk about how you can not waste acres when it comes to deer habitat and ultimately wildlife habitat that you're either finding or building, hunting on your own land, and how that relates. This little subtitle right here, big deer hunting on small parcels. That's what I want for you. We're going to talk about that. There's a lot of land out there that someone has 400 acres because they're driving through it with an ATV, because they have dead areas of poor habitat. And I'll give you an example of CRP, for example. You can have mixtures of grasses and forbs and forages, but if it's laying down in the fall, it's dead habitat, meaning it's not supporting any wildlife. It's not cover, it's not food at that time of the year, and it's not helping your situation, and it's hurting your land. If you have lots of big dead areas, if you have lots of areas of open timber, open hardwoods, there's no cover, there's no food. Open fields, CRP, it's laying down in the winter, laying down in the fall. It's dead cover. And so there's a lot of people, by how they manage the land and not making a cohesive unit of movement. And it doesn't mean that every acre has to be improved. What it means, though, is that every acre has a purpose. If it's open cover, that's what you're accessing through. That's what you're blowing your scent into. That open cover might be even separating deer. Bedding areas here, bedding areas there, a food source, bedding area. But it all has to relate to each other so that it establishes a unit of movement on your land that allows you to get on and off the land without spooking deer. Maybe you have a center road that goes through your parcel. On big parcels, we see that all the time, where you have a right and a left half. You might be able to go around both those halves. Now you have lots of hunting opportunity, and it might be that it goes through an open area that can't be anything other than open. Or maybe it's a ridge system. I've had a really cool valley access where it goes right through the middle of the property. It's a deep valley. That's where the cabin's at. And then you go up the steep ridges on either side and have completely different hunting parcels. That's pretty cool. But bottom line is, there's a lot of 400 acres out there, and Dylan was talking about, he saw a big one recently. It just had a lot of areas of dead timber, a lot of open areas, meaning dead timber, meaning it's just open hardwoods, open fields, and it turns very large parcels into small parcels. Why is that bad? It's bad because, number two here, not only does it hurt your deer opportunity, the amount of deer you can hold on the land, especially the mature bucks. We see it all the time where there's a lot of dead acres, wasted acres, poor access, poor hunter access, a lot of spooking deer. Does and fawns can tolerate that. They have a very small window of daylight movement, does and fawns. Their home range is very small. It can be very deceiving. Land has tons of deer, but they're all does and fawn. It's not that the neighbors are doing something wrong, because a lot of people blame the neighbors for that. It's just simply that you're not making a mature buck parcel. I've seen many parcels where, because of where the habitat was located, because of the access, because there wasn't enough depth of cover away from food sources where a mature buck can go into his own spot and call home, there's just no mature bucks. And the bucks, they pass them as 1.5 years old, 2.5, 3.5, they're sometimes around, and then all of a sudden they're gone, and at 5.5, well, that's that buck. He was shot 1.5 miles away on someone else's property. They haven't even seen it for a year. That happens consistently because a mature buck outgrows, as he ages, the reclusiveness that the parcel provides. He needs something greater. What does that do, number two? If this land is $3,000 per acre, 400 acre parcel, obviously is worth $1.2 million. 40 acre parcel in that area is worth 120. There's a lot of 400 acre parcels that, as they hunt, as they relate to the deer herd that they create, are equal to a 40 acre parcel at 120,000. They've taken $1.2 million in property and turned it into a $120,000 piece as it relates to the deer hunting and the expectations and the potential of that land. You don't want to do that. Trust me, we see it all the time. All the time. And I would say the average property that's over 100 acres, this applies to. Because they have 100 acres, but it hunts like 10. They have 1,000 acres, but it hunts like 50 or 100. And you can't throw enough money at it to erase that fact, because a lot of it relates to access, habitat improvements in the wrong locations, and it sets yourself up to spook deer every time you go out, and you're creating a very poor deer habitat or very poor deer herd as it relates to the potential and value of the land. And that's a very bad thing because you're wasting a lot of dollars. You might as well just own 40 acres and do it right. Do it right on that 40, and you've only spent $120,000 instead of $1.2 million. And that's, of course, out of the reach of most people. I'm not saying this is a common thing, but there's a lot of 40-acre parcels that hunt like 0 acres because you can't expect anything to happen during the daylight because of what's happened. It's always better to be that 10-acre parcel, that 30, that 40, that 50 acres, and let it hunt like a 400-acre parcel because everyone around you is hunting poorly, accessing poorly, and spending too much on deer habitat as it relates to the potential success and the success they're actually receiving on the land. Number 3, what is depth of cover? And I hope Dylan can look over on this side right here. Is this in the frame okay, Dylan? Yep. Depth of cover, and I do this with, a paper sometimes, but depth of cover is you have a 40-acre parcel. If you have food, it relates to cover and food. So if you have food in the middle, and that's a 5-acre chunk of food, you have 155 yards of depth in any direction before you hit your border. Think of this as just all open field around there. If you have the food in the middle, all your deer have to be sandwiched within this 155 yards of depth in any direction. That's your depth. So on average, a 40-acre parcel is 440 yards. So your depth to cover ratio, depth to overall potential of cover ratio is 155 to 440. Hope that makes sense. Roughly around 30% would be your depth to cover ratio. That's not very good. I'll show you an example. Let's take a 20-acre parcel. Put that same 5-acre food plot in the front. Now you have over 300 yards of depth from edge of food to back. That means you can have young bucks or young does and fawns, doe family groups, younger bucks, and you actually have enough depth for bucks to actually bed within the confines of the property. Here you don't. You'll have does and fawns take this. You have to access along your borders. It leaves no room left over for mature bucks during the daylight. Who cares if they come on at night? That's not where you grade a property or how a property is doing. That's depth of cover. That's something I wrote about in my 2012 Whitetails by Design book and how to design your property. It's an important concept that I created and I teach often. It's something, it's with the way that Dylan looks at properties now. I look at properties this way, but everything is built around that particular depth based on food. And it's the same with public land. You might have a big clear-cut area. How much depth do you have that you can actually hunt in? I'm typically hunting in that depth towards the inner recesses, way back in a remote area. That depth, typically where I hunt up like in the UP of Michigan, that would relate to bait piles that are surrounding me 3/4 mile to a mile away. I'm getting in that center area where there's not a lot of deer sign, but that's where those mature bucks are going to be. That's where they go back to on big public vast land with tens of thousands of acres. They're going to go back into those center areas away from pressure, and they're going to be within that deepest part of that amount of depth as it relates to that food and those bait piles and that high pressure situation. And they have that room, and when they have that room, they actually stay alive, they grow older, and that's where you have those mature bucks. So depth of cover is really critical. Public land, it might be a clear cut and you're going off on a bench a half mile away. You know the deer feeding in that clear cut. If I know they're there right after dark or after dark, then I'm going to find that bedding area that would be a half mile away. And you don't need to find a particular deer bed. A mature buck beds in different deer beds throughout an area, but he'll be in an area. It might be within a 5-10 acre area. Once you find that area, you have them. Because now you have morning stand opportunities, afternoon stand opportunities, closer to food, that morning bedding area. And that creates that depth, but that depth of cover allows you to have morning stands back here, and then afternoon, evening stands back here, and then that rut cruising opportunity in between as they're going back and forth. So it gives you a stand assemblage. Without depth, you don't have that stand. So that stand assemblage. So that's depth of cover. Think about it. And think about right here, this 20 acre parcel right here, as it relates to deer hunting, is worth far more than that 40-acre parcel if you can't move the food, because it establishes effective depth. I would never even consider buying that 40 if I couldn't put the food somewhere else, because it doesn't establish enough depth to actually create a good deer herd on the parcel. So this 20, kind of like this, you know, obviously it's pretty extreme, 400 acres to 40 acres, but think about it just with 20 acres versus 40. Big difference in value with that 20 acres. You want to buy that. You'd rather have two parcels at 20 acres than one parcel at 40 acres that has a wrong depth cover or a poor depth of cover ratio. What you can do, number 4. What's really cool about this is once you have an effective depth established, which is established, your first thing you're looking at is food, because that's going to establish the depth. Without food, there's no deer filling that space anyways. So without food, doesn't matter how much depth you have. You don't have depth without food, because if they don't have food, they're not going to stay in your land or focus on it during the daylight. They might be randomly passing through, but we're not talking about random improvements. We're talking about specifically designing land and designing your hunt on public land to give you morning hunts, afternoon hunts, hunts in between, and to specifically build a deer herd. You can't do that without food. So the food begins first. So on that 20-acre parcel, you have food down here. This is the first area. Once you have that food, I work on screening around that edge. Maybe this is the road down here. You know, I'm not working on, you know, you want screening right here, but it's not going to hold deer. You're not going to have that bedding. So this is very important to have this depth here. That gives you these layers of opportunity for deer to bed. And then I'm enhancing these layers. And it might be in something like this, because I don't want deer on my borders. I want to be able to access around my property without spooking deer. So once I do that, then I have areas back here where, boy, maybe I work on some little mounds back here for bucks. But does it make sense the bucks aren't going to be there if you don't have adequate cover throughout this area to begin with? So I want to have adequate cover so that I can increase that depth. So here I'm working on screening around that food plot. People talk about creating edge or feathering an edge, and they'll talk about feathering an edge by chainsawing along that. They even have dollars in some states for that, for edge feathering. That's not edge feathering. Edge feathering is grasses to briars to shrubs to hardwood regeneration. That's feathering. You have that gradual taper up with different layers. That produces wildlife, let alone whitetails. So you create that, and then you go into your habitat, you know, your overall habitat. Maybe it's a select cut that you're going to do. I'm leaving these outside areas open so I can actually access. Maybe there's a road going through the property. You're doing this on both sides. But bottom line is, this open timber is for access. You're blowing your scent into it, and that allows you to be able to get around your property without spooking deer. Then you're working from your food plot back, your major food source back. And this is the same if you have a great clear cut on public land, but it's all open timber that doesn't hold deer. It's pretty easy to find where the bucks are that are relating to that actual clear cut. By looking at the thickest cover adjacent to that, whether it's 400 or 500 yards away, that's where I'm going to hunt, because they're probably not going to move through that open cover to get to that clear cut during daylight. So I'm going to go back in. If I know they're hitting that clear cut, then it becomes easy. If I know they're hitting these bay piles out here on public land, it becomes easy to find where they're at on public land by just finding the appropriate amount of cover that they need to hold them during the daylight and still relate to that food source. I always think on public land, you're going to move a lot further to relate to that food source during the day to where that bedding area cover is than in ag land, where there's not a lot of cover available and there's not a lot of food. They're going to be sandwiched a lot tighter. They're going to move a lot smaller distance during the daytime as it relates to big wilderness areas where there's not a lot of deer. So I always think about how much cover is from that food source all the way back to where they're bedding. And again, you can turn a 20-acre parcel. Think of all those layers of cuttings that you can do. You can have select cut, timber stand rotation. You're leaving open, mature timber on the outside. And then you're going into specific knolls or locations, islands, where you create clear-cut bedding pockets. I always enhance that. If there are cuttings within the woods, you can enhance that by adding conifers. Changing the diversity. If you're talking about a big stand of red cedar throughout the whole 20 acres, well, then take pockets out, keep the red cedar out of those areas. Don't level the whole thing. You have your base form of cover already with the red cedar. But you're enhancing that cover, and then that creates a lot more compartmentalization of the habitat, so you can separate not only deer from each other and bucks from each other and fit more deer on the land, but wildlife. And that's why I talk about one of the signs of bad whitetail habitat or that you need to make changes is you don't have a lot of small game on your property. If you do this and you have lots of diversity on your land, you fill that cover, select cuts, clear cut pockets, change the diversity where needed to add conifer components, briar shrubs, whatever it might be. Switchgrass can be that base cover too in a field, and then you're creating those pockets within of diversity. But bottom line is if you have all that edge and diversity, you're going to have small game. Number 5, the cover always complements food, not the other way around. You start with food. So when you're looking on public land, you start with the major food sources, whether it's a bunch of collections of bait piles up north in Michigan, in the UP of Michigan, another portion where you have, I'd say Southern Ohio, big public land area, you're not allowed to use bait, but then it's surrounded by private land where they do use bait. So you're hunting back within that depth, half mile, quarter mile away from those locations, coming in a back door, waiting for those deer to come back to you in the morning. You're right in that sweet spot of daytime movement, a mature buck. You're shooting them right at your feet. Shot a really nice buck in 2011, I think it was, in public land up in Michigan. And that buck was routinely feeding on several people's bait piles. And I found out later, they gave me pictures, and it was routinely feeding on those bait piles after dark, middle of dark. And I'm shooting him about 3/4 of a mile away, right in his bedroom window at 10:30 in the morning. He's just walking through, cruising, no pressure. Nothing there. That was that sweet spot. And private land, that would have been 300 yards away, 400 yards away if it was big ag and sandwich cover where there's not a lot of cover. The bottom line is he wasn't out there unless he has those bait piles to go to after dark, and that becomes that primary food source at that time. It's the same with big, giant, fresh clear cuts, 1 to 3 year old down in Southern Ohio, Southern Illinois, Missouri, versus maybe those clear cuts that are 5 to 7 years old that actually have some decent growth in those northern regions of hard maple and aspen, whatever it might be, that relate to that too. And again, it's kind of funny, but you find a lot of small game in those areas too where you have that regeneration. On private land, you have to have those food plots. You can never manage your property by just saying, well, I'm increasing the cover. You don't have depth of cover if you don't have the food. The food is what establishes it. Again, the cover complements food, not the other way around. So you can use fancy terms like TSI, timber stand improvement, early successional growth. You can find all the scientific names out there and people advising you to create these improvements. But if you don't have the food plots on private land, you're wasting your time, because the second someone does have quality food a mile away, you're not going to see any deer. So it's critical on private land that you plant food plots. The big risk is you put food plots in the wrong location. You spend too many dollars on your food and not hitting the actual needs of the deer herd in that area. You set yourself up for failure because you put food in the wrong location as it relates to your hunter access, and you spook deer. You invite all the deer in the neighborhood to your land and this great food plot only to spook them. Then you're doing way, way more harm than good. The trick is to manage the food. So that's the first thing we look at when we look at a property is, where does food go? Where can it go safely as it relates to hunter access, permanent hunter access, not, well, my neighbor's cousin's friend gives us access across this ag field because they once knew the farmer. Not that kind of stuff. I'm talking about what's long-term permanent access that you can build a property around. That relates to where your food plot goes and your food plots go, however they fit within based on your resources, the type of land, type of soil. Then once we have that, the access and the food, then you're working on depth of cover. Once you have that proper depth and you make those improvements into the parcel, through the parcel, now you can hunt those bedding areas that you create in the morning during the rut, during the second rut. You can create those afternoon movements to the food source. Bottom line is you don't spook out the food source, and now you have a stand assemblage where you have afternoon, evening stands, and morning stands, and it gives you different wind varieties to hunt. You're always working around that depth. Then you use one of Dylanisms. When you look at your property, can you see 100 yards through it with an inch of snow on the ground? It's probably not thick enough. And that's where, if you can see big open areas, you have big wasted areas of acreage. And we've both been on properties where you can see a quarter mile through timber. And that's a very bad thing, because again, it goes back to people are buying this land for deer hunting. They're spending a lot of money and they're only getting a fraction of the value as it relates to that because they don't have depth of cover. So this is a way to turn a small parcel into a really big parcel. And if you don't follow this advice, it's a great way to turn a really big parcel into a really small parcel, wasting a lot of dollars, a lot of time, a lot of your resources. And if you care about doing your best, depth of cover is something you need to apply to your property so you can have a great hunt, a great herd, because you can't have one without the other. Think of depth of cover when you're thinking about your land this year, with a potential of a land that you might be hunting next year, or a new land you might find, and you'll be on the right track to a great hunt this fall. Folks, I want to make sure you check out my web class video series, whether it's how to design your food plot program or how to design your property in general. And we have a new one coming out that'll be how to hunt the rut. But these bucks back here are a testament. Some of these bucks go back to 93. They're even in different states. I urge you to check out those web classes so that you can help yourself, help your land, help your hunt. The link is in the description. And also for those that have tried them out, I encourage you to offer some feedback in the comments below. Thank you.